I moved into the house in late autumn after months of searching for something that felt permanent. The house was older than I had intended, a Victorian that sagged slightly at the corners and had paint peeling like layers of skin, but it had a kind of stubborn charm. High ceilings, tall windows that framed the sky like a painting, and rooms that felt like spaces you could inhabit rather than just pass through. I was desperate for privacy after years of apartment living where walls were thin and neighbors pressed their lives against mine. The realtor had handed me the keys with a faint smile that suggested she was as glad as I was that someone had taken the house off her hands. The first night was quiet, more quiet than I had expected. The house groaned in the wind, and the floors whispered under my steps. It smelled faintly of old wood and dust that refused to leave. I unpacked only the essentials, leaving the boxes stacked in corners because the thought of arranging everything made my head spin. I was tired and relieved and satisfied with the silence. I found a mirror in a shop that sold objects from previous lives. The shop was a converted stable with low ceilings and shelves crammed with curiosities that seemed to breathe. The shopkeeper was an elderly man who wiped dust from objects with the slow deliberation of someone who had handled fragile things all his life. The mirror leaned against a wall in a dim corner. Its frame was carved with leaves and vines, dulled by age but still intricate, and the glass had a faint wave to it, as if it had been poured and not pressed. It reflected the shop in a soft, wrong way. The reflection of the ceiling seemed too tall, the corners slightly skewed. I liked that. I bought it and carried it home, imagining it hanging somewhere I could see it often. I placed it in the hallway connecting the living room and the bedroom. The mirror felt like it had belonged to some other life entirely. For the first few days, it reflected what it should. The couch, the lamp, the uneven spines of the books on the shelf. I walked past it without thinking. The first thing I noticed that was unusual was the plant. I had placed a potted rubber plant near a window. Its leaves were vibrant, leaning toward the sunlight. One morning, after watering it, I walked past the mirror and noticed that in the reflection the leaves were curled inward slightly, like someone had pinched them. I convinced myself I was imagining it. Plants are strange. Later that day, the living room reflected in the mirror began to diverge from the actual room. The couch seemed slightly shifted to the left. The armchair by the window appeared closer to the wall. A throw blanket that had been draped casually over the sofa appeared neatly folded in the reflection. I moved the actual blanket. The reflection did not change. My stomach dropped. The mirror was no longer a mirror. It was something else. 4 nights after, I avoided it. When I walked past, my pace quickened. Shadows seemed to stretch behind the glass. I could almost feel eyes. One night, I woke and went to the hallway. The mirror was dark except for a faint rectangle of streetlight. For a moment, I thought I could see my own reflection. Then a small shape moved across the glass, a fleeting suggestion of motion. I froze. Curiosity forced me to test the mirror. I left a note taped to the glass that said, "Come see," in simple handwriting. I stepped back. In my hallway, nothing moved. The reflection, however, showed a room with an armchair, a small table with a vase, and a framed photograph. I did not recognize the photograph. My heart beat fast. I dismantled the frame to see if there was some optical trick. There was nothing inside. The mirror was ordinary in its materials, yet what it showed was not. Days passed. Sleep became thin. Dreams and waking life intertwined. I dreamed of walking into the mirror and entering the other house. I dreamed of its occupants, a man in a sweater sitting at a table, a child running across the room. I would wake and the hallway smelled like cleaning solution and old wood, nothing like the warm air of the dream. One morning, my favorite mug disappeared. Blue ceramic with a chip on the rim. It was used every day. I checked the kitchen, the cabinets, the dishwasher. Nothing. I glanced at the mirror. There was on the windowsill in the other house, the exact color, the exact chip. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I reached to touch the glass. Nothing changed. The mug was out of reach. I tried to ignore it. I failed. Each day the mirror revealed more. The man in the sweater had routines. He made coffee. He read newspapers. He moved things on a shelf. A child appeared sometimes, running, laughing, disappearing. The house was alive, but entirely separate. I began keeping a notebook of everything missing and everything appearing in the mirror. Coins, socks, small objects. Writing it down gave me a sense of control that reality refused to offer. I became obsessed with patterns, times when a mirror showed movement, when it was empty, when objects shifted. One late afternoon, the man in the reflection held the blue mug. He turned it in his hands as if inspecting it. He did not look at me. He sat on the windowsill and then reached his hand toward the mirror as if he could push it across to my side. I stood frozen. His hand retreated. He placed the mug back on the sill and walked out of frame. The house darkened. The reflection became still again. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the hallway watching the mirror. Every small noise in the house set my nerves on edge. I imagined the other house breathing, existing without me. I imagined the other house noticing me in return. My mind felt like it was splitting, trying to contain both realities. Days merged into nights. I watched the mirror obsessively. The mirror watched back. I realized I had become part of its strange rhythm. My life, my habits, my attention belonged to something beyond comprehension, a world that paralleled mine, yet moved independently. I could not escape it. The mirror demanded vigilance and curiosity. It had become both a window and a tether. At the end of part 1, I sit before the mirror, aware that what I see is not merely a reflection. It is a house with its own life, its own occupants, borrowing objects from my world, its gaze reaching into my own. I do not know if the other house exists outside the glass, if it is a trick of perception, or if it is something older, more deliberate. I know only that I cannot look away. The mirror began to dominate my days. I would wake and immediately glance at it, as if its surface were the first proof that the day had begun. The other house existed there, in plain view, yet stubbornly separate. It was more than a reflection. It was a life unfolding, uninterrupted by my presence. One evening, I saw the man again. He was arranging books on a shelf. His movements were meticulous and deliberate. I leaned closer, noticing details I had not before. The edges of his sweater were frayed, the skin of his hands thin and pale, the lines on his face deepened with age. A candle flickered on a side table, its flame unmoving despite the presence of a breeze in my hallway. I realized the mirror did not obey physics as I understood it. It had its own rules. I tried interacting. I placed objects against the glass. A notebook, a pen, a single fork. Sometimes they appeared in the reflection, sometimes they did not. The unpredictability became maddening. I began testing patterns, moving objects at different hours, observing the other house's response. It was as if the mirror was alive and could choose what it reflected, what it hid, and what it returned. The child appeared more frequently. I could not see the face, only the motion, the tilt of a head, the careful way it handled small toys. The presence was not threatening at first, only uncanny. But after a week, I noticed that my own movements would trigger responses. If I walked past the mirror carrying a cup, in the reflection the child would pick up a similar cup, even if the cup did not exist in the other house. The mirror had begun to mimic, to mirror in ways that suggested awareness. I became obsessive. Friends noticed I rarely left the house. I would speak to them on the phone with a mirror in sight, turning my chair so I could see it behind me. They joked that I was losing it, but I could not abandon the mirror. It had become a portal I could not stop watching. One night, I woke to the sound of glass moving. My bedroom window was closed, the door shut. I crept to the hallway. The mirror's surface rippled faintly, like water. The man in the sweater was kneeling in the reflection. I could see a small box beside him. He opened it carefully and took something out. I could not make out what it was, but it seemed familiar. My heart raced. I realized he was handling one of my objects again. I tried to intervene. I shouted, banged on the glass. Nothing changed. The reflection continued. He replaced the object in the box and closed it. Then he looked toward a door in his house and vanished. The surface returned to its flat stillness. Sleep left me entirely. My days were measured in brief obsessions and frantic notes. I tracked the times the man and child appeared, the objects they handled, the changes in the other house's light. The mirror's power over me grew. I began to imagine the house outside my own, a world parallel but independent, full of lives that could not touch mine except through the thin layer of glass. Objects began to disappear. A book I had been reading vanished from my nightstand and appeared in the other house in the reflection. A photograph, a pair of scissors, even a single pen. Each time, the mirror did not reflect the object being removed. It simply appeared in the other house, untouched, as if it had always been there. I realized then that the mirror was not merely reflecting. It was exchanging, borrowing, moving. The other house was aware of me, and I was aware of it. And in that awareness, the mirror had agency. Weeks passed. My life contracted to the hallway where the mirror stood. My meals became irregular. My sleep vanished entirely. The other house moved with increasing clarity, as if it had grown accustomed to my observation. The man in the sweater now handled objects without hesitation. The child played games I could not understand. Occasionally a woman appeared, arranging dishes or laundry, careful not to disturb the man or child. I began seeing myself in the reflection. Not my actual reflection, but a faint silhouette moving behind the figures of the other house. My own motions were mimicked in tiny, delayed ways. It was subtle at first, a finger moving to adjust hair, a hand resting on a table, then more overtly, as if the mirror was learning me, recording me, placing me in its world without my consent. Fear became a physical weight. I could feel in my chest and stomach, in the pressure behind my eyes. I stopped leaving the hallway. I sat in a chair for hours, watching. The mirror's surface rippled like water when I moved too quickly, distorting the other house's interior in ways that made my mind reel. One night, I saw the man hold my blue mug once more. He lifted it to the window and stared at it. I approached the glass. The mirror's surface shifted, and I was suddenly aware of the air in the other house. It smelled of old wood, of bread baking, of something faintly floral I could not identify. I felt the texture of the floorboards in my own feet as if they were connected through the glass. The mirror had become a doorway, and I could not close it. I realized I was no longer an observer. I was part of its rhythm, part of the other house's unfolding life. Every object I owned became a participant. Every glance, every movement recorded and mirrored in ways I did not understand. I cannot explain why I continued to watch. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was inevitability. The house in the mirror existed. It moved. It handled my things. It observed. It waited. And I waited with it. The mirror had begun to dominate not only my days, but my perception of reality. I could not step into the living room without noticing it. Even when my back was turned, I felt the pull, as though the glass demanded attention, and the other house insisted on recognition. My life had narrowed to the hallway. My footsteps measured in pacing around the mirror. My waking hours spent cataloging its subtle changes. Objects vanished with greater frequency. A small wooden bowl disappeared from my counter and appeared in the other house, filled with something that looked like breadcrumbs. A single sock would vanish and reappear neatly folded on a chair in the reflection. These were no coincidences. The mirror was deliberate, intentional, as though it had an intelligence I could not comprehend. I tried removing the objects entirely from the house, locking them in drawers, burying them in closets. But still, at some point, they appeared in the other house, as if it had the patience to wait until I lowered my guard. The man in the sweater had become almost a ritual. He moved with precise intent, performing tasks I began to anticipate. He would take my objects, examine them, replace them with subtle variations that unsettled me. Sometimes he would glance toward the mirror, and I imagined his gaze piercing into my own house, into my private spaces, measuring, cataloging, understanding. The child moved with curious fascination, exploring objects that I had left out deliberately, then vanishing from sight. I attempted to document everything meticulously. A notebook filled with sketches, times, objects, shifts in the other house's light, gestures, movements. But the more I documented, the more I felt a growing hollowness, as if writing was insufficient to contain the reality I was witnessing. Each day, I found the mirror more invasive, more insistent, a window into a life that obeyed no rules I recognized. One evening, I awoke to the sound of footsteps. The house was silent, the street outside empty. My bedroom door was closed. The mirror rippled faintly in the dim light. I approached, heart pounding, and saw the man holding a photograph. I could not make out the face in the reflection, but the photograph seemed familiar. He examined it carefully, then placed it on a table. A candle flickered nearby, casting shadows that made the room seem older, haunted by a past I could not access. Then I noticed something new. The mirror no longer reflected only my house. The walls behind me seemed to bend in its surface, creating an illusion of depth I had never seen. The hallway elongated into impossible angles. I could see my own bedroom reflected in impossible positions, objects floating or duplicated. The rules of physics had broken entirely. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I realized that the mirror was no longer merely a window. It was a space, a parallel reality, one that had begun to reach out. Objects I could not trace had appeared suddenly in my home. A small toy, a candle, a single earring. Their origins were undeniable. They came from the other house. I could not escape the sense that the mirror was watching me, measuring me, deciding what to give and what to take. Sleep became impossible. My body existed in the house, but my mind wandered into the reflection. I dreamed vividly of the other house, walking through rooms that corresponded to mine, but with differences that were subtle and insidious. In dreams, the man would smile faintly as if aware I was observing. The child would run past, and I would hear laughter that was not mine. Objects shifted in ways I could not predict, small and disturbing variations that gnawed at my sense of reality. One night, I resolved to confront it. I stood in the hallway, hands trembling, and spoke aloud. I demanded the return of my things. I demanded to know what it wanted. I pressed my hand to the glass. The surface rippled as if alive, a faint vibration under my palm. In the reflection, the man paused, looked toward me, and then slowly lifted his hand. For a moment, I thought he would place something across the glass, offer a window into understanding, but he did not. Instead, he vanished into another room, the reflection returning to stillness. The sense of being watched intensified. I began locking doors, hiding items, attempting to reclaim control, but the mirror's influence spread. I started hearing faint sounds when I passed by it, the creak of floorboards, the shuffle of movement, whispers just beyond comprehension. My own reflection seemed delayed, a second or two behind my actions. I could feel a presence, not merely a reflection, but an entity aware of me, considering me, testing the boundaries of my life. By the end of part 4, I was no longer simply an observer. I had become a participant, unwilling and terrified, in a slow exchange of realities. The mirror did not only reflect, it consumed attention, patience, and presence. I feared the inevitable, that what existed in the reflection might one day reach through, that the boundary between my house and the other would dissolve, leaving me not as a watcher, but as something observed, vulnerable, and alone. It began subtly at first. Shadows stretched beyond where they should have been, lingering in corners of the reflection that did not exist in my house. My own reflection became delayed, fragmented, sometimes showing me performing acts I had not yet committed. The mirror had begun to manipulate perception itself, bending not only space but the continuity of time, and I realized I had no control over what it showed, only over what I chose to watch. Objects vanished entirely. Books I had read for years disappeared from shelves, only to appear in the other house with faint markings I did not recognize. A set of keys, a favorite pen, a single shoe, all disappeared and reappeared in the reflection. Each loss sent a shiver through me, a hollow awareness that the mirror was marking me, keeping score, and that the other house had begun to dictate the boundaries of my life. I attempted to resist. I covered the mirror with sheets, taped cardboard over the surface, even tried removing it entirely from the wall. Nothing mattered. The reflection persisted, visible through the slightest cracks, through gaps in the cardboard, even in dreams where the mirror seemed omnipresent, looming at the edges of vision. I realized that the mirror had established a permanent connection, and I had become an unwilling participant in a world that had no regard for my consent. The figures became more distinct. The man no longer acted as if unaware of me. He began looking toward the mirror with deliberate attention, glances that suggested he could see beyond the glass, into my house, into my habits, my fears. The child appeared less playful, more calculating, observing me, learning patterns, moving with precision rather than whimsy. Occasionally, a woman appeared, her presence now tense, as if she understood the mirror's power and measured it against her own space. The mirror itself began to change. The edges darkened, the surface rippled faintly like water, and sometimes a low hum seemed to emanate from it, barely perceptible but undeniably present. I could feel vibrations in the floor when I approached. My own reflection no longer obeyed me. At times it lagged, showing me reaching for objects moments after I had moved, performing gestures I had not yet made, creating an impossible feedback loop that eroded my sense of self. I realized then that the mirror had begun to reach for reality itself, not merely observing, not merely borrowing objects, but altering the world around it in subtle, horrifying ways. Lights in my house flickered to match those in the other house. The temperature shifted in response to the reflection, cold drafts where none should exist. Objects would appear or vanish without explanation, as though the glass was the arbiter of what could exist in my life. One night, exhausted, trembling, I watched as the man picked up a box. Inside were objects from my life, small trinkets, keys, photographs, notes I had written. He examined them, arranged them carefully, and then slowly turned toward the mirror, as if acknowledging me. My hands went to my face in panic. I wanted to look away, to flee, but my gaze was locked. He smiled faintly, a motion that felt impossible to interpret. Then he moved to a door I could not see beyond in the reflection and disappeared. The surface of the mirror rippled again, and I felt the cold brush of an unseen presence against my skin. From that night onward, I began to see myself within the other house, not as my reflection, but as a shadow in the corner of rooms, faint, distorted, performing acts I had not committed. I watched in horror as the other house, the mirror, and my shadow self began to overlap. It was as if the mirror had begun to merge the realities, creating a space where my life and its mirrored life were no longer distinct, where the boundary between observer and observed had collapsed entirely. The mirror's influence spread. Doors in my house that I had never opened creaked ajar. Objects moved in ways I cannot account for. I would find chairs shifted, drawers slightly open, items rearranged to match scenes in the other house. The sense of being watched was constant, oppressive, suffocating. I realized that the mirror was not merely a portal, but a predator, patient, deliberate, waiting for me to slip entirely into its reality. I tried to destroy it. Hammers, axes, stones, I struck the glass. Each time, it cracked superficially but did not shatter. The reflection remained intact, unbroken, the other house unaffected, the figures continuing their routines as though nothing had changed. The mirror had become indestructible, a permanent fixture that would outlast me, outlast everything I had ever known. Eventually, I stopped trying. I could no longer distinguish my life from the mirrored life. My own actions became hesitant, measured, performed with the awareness that the other house mirrored, copied, anticipated. I became a participant, a ghost in my own home, a servant to a reflection that was more real than reality itself. The last thing I remember clearly is the child reaching for me in the mirror, its hand pressed against the glass, mimicking my own. I leaned closer, and for a moment, the surface seemed fluid. The air in my hallway shifted, smelled of bread and wood and flowers I did not recognize. I felt myself pulled, inch by inch, toward the reflection, my own reflection.